Adolf Hitler's relationship with the moral problems of humanity is curious to say the least, as there was a great tension between civilization and the barbarity of Nazi methods. Germany in the Third Reich presented itself as a positive beacon of ethics and progress to the world, while near its borders, concentration camps were established where truly inhuman acts were carried out. But the Holocaust was not the only gesture of immoral brutality that National Socialism gave. It also plagued occupied Europe with brothels and whorehouses, in which Hitler fed the lowest instincts of his troops. These brothels, where feasts of animal excess were held, were spread throughout the countries conquered by the Germans, and found their epicenter in Paris. Once considered the City of Lights, from 1940 onwards, the Nazis turned it into the capital of lust. French women became the main pastime of the Wehrmacht soldiers, and the Führer made sure that they had as much entertainment as possible. However, Nazi brothels reached their most sinister version within the barracks of concentration camps, where Jewish women were sexually exploited against their will by SS soldiers. Usually run by German guards turned prostitutes, these spaces of horror took the atrocities of the Holocaust to another level, surpassing those scattered throughout the cities of Europe. Are you ready to learn the sinister hidden history of Nazi brothels?
Ce qui était interdit en Allemagne était autorisé en France. Je ne sais pas si c'est ça la liberté, mais ça m'a permis de profiter de choses que je n'avais pas chez moi. Comme les bordels, par exemple.
As this Wehrmacht veteran tells it, other young Germans belonging to Hitler's army gave themselves over to the worldly pleasures offered by the streets of Paris. In a certain way, the capital of France was always a libertine place, where artists and intellectuals from all over Europe met to venture into the deepest corners of the night. Drinks, hallucinogens, and exotic dances. The heat of the flesh flowed through the Parisian brothels like water, through the canals of Venice. From the poorest to the richest, everyone found somewhere to satisfy their sexual appetites. Even at the end of the 1930s, with a good part of the continent turning socio-culturally towards conservatism and fascism, French civil society encouraged the exploration of sexual freedom. However, while Parisians gave themselves over to intellectuality and excess, they were unaware that not far from there, Hitler was preparing an invasion. Fantasizing that the Maginot Line was impenetrable, the French entrusted their security to this fortified wall that ran along the border with Italy and Germany. But they were unaware that the system designed during the First World War had a major strategic error. On May 10, 1940, Hitler ordered an advance against France, and the Blitzkrieg, the German strategy of overwhelming the enemy, struck mercilessly. The Maginot Line, far from offering an armored refuge against the Reich's tanks, divided the Allied forces into two smaller fronts, which could not withstand the onslaught of the Wehrmacht. In just 6 weeks, the cold German boot had crushed the French defenses. On June 22nd, the Nazis entered Paris in triumph, leaving this image as the greatest symbol of their power.
Les Allemands avaient la réputation d'être des barbares, surtout en France. Et là, les barbares arrivent, mais on découvre qu'ils ne ressemblaient pas à des barbares et qu'ils ne se comportaient pas comme tels. Il s'est avéré qu'ils ne mangeaient pas de petits-enfants non plus, chose dont on n'était pas si sûr au début. Ils avaient l'aura des vainqueurs. Ils fascinaient tout le monde, sans exception, même les hommes. On peut comprendre que l'arrivée de ces soldats, avec leurs uniformes bien taillés, leurs bottes en cuir sur leurs motos, était une véritable sensation.
With their historic national pride shattered, the French, who had been synonymous with progress in the 19th century, watched helplessly as the Germans, whom they considered barbarians and had defeated in World War I, surrounded the Eiffel Tower with their tanks. The feeling on the German side, however, was very different. Many soldiers of the Wehrmacht stated that their first impression upon entering Paris was being struck by the beauty of the women. In fact, Some Germans found the suggestive mannerisms of the French insulting, as described by soldier Ernst in a letter to his wife in Germany.
Tu n'en croirais pas tes yeux en voyant le maudit maquillage dont les femmes se barbouillent le visage. Si mon épouse faisait de la sorte, je ferais mes bagages et je m'en irais sur le champ. C'est incroyable. Très souvent, je dois penser à autre chose, sinon je suis pris de violentes nausées. Ses lèvres rouges vifs, ses visages peints en jaune, ses sourcils surlignés de noir et ses vernis à ongles éclatants. Derrière ce tape à l'œil se cache une grande cochonnerie.
Although many Germans shared Ernst's opinion in public, in private, they felt lustful emotions towards the ladies of Paris. The makeup, the revealing dresses, the well-groomed appearance, and the voluptuous forms inflamed the soldiers' passion. They were so different from the hard-featured women in uniform promoted by Nazi propaganda in Germany that they reminded young men of pre-war times, before National Socialist homologation. Going from Berlin to Paris was like going from a grocery store to an exhibition of lustful women. Needless to say, the soldiers' excitement had to find a channel, and at first, the French madams were willing to offer the best services to the exhausted Germans. In the first years of occupation, the brothels of Paris lived a golden age, reaching some 177 locations spread throughout the Seine region. The Nazis, when they were not on guard duty, spent their time among the bars and sex workers. Such was the demand that the Wehrmacht decided to requisition the 22 most important brothels in the city, which began to run under the indirect command of the Führer.
Los soldados recibieron una lista de los burdeles autorizados. En ellos no dudaban en filmarse retozando con prostitutas a modo de souvenir personal. En los prostíbulos podían ver películas pornográficas francesas como esta, que un soldado consiguió en 1940 y se llevó como recuerdo de la campaña de Francia.
The number of prostitutes grew from a few thousand to over 10,000, and because officers spent virtually all of their pay, the supply of sexual labor became one of the most profitable businesses for young women at the time. Brothels spread across Paris like a virus, establishing themselves in private homes, basements of bars, hotels, and even in some upper-class buildings. The Führer was okay with these practices, as he preferred his men to view foreign women as a hobby rather than in more serious ways. Hitler knew that an occupying force could not humanize the enemy without weakening itself. In fact, high-ranking officers gave soldiers strict orders not to engage in liaisons or conversations with civilian women.
Éviter tout contact avec la population civile. Il est interdit d'emmener des Françaises dans une voiture de fonction ou de les tenir par le bras.
Paris, the city without eyes, silently screamed all the dirty secrets hidden in its brothels. No one ignored that prostitution was increasing exponentially, and that invading soldiers inhabited these places as if they were their second home. But this wasn't just happening with low-ranking Nazis. Officers with high positions also had their preferred spots. Perhaps the most notable brothel among the Germans was Le Chabanais. It was located near the Louvre Museum and was considered the center of perversion in French high society. This house of luxury had existed for a century before World War II, and its fame preceded it. It had been a playground for aristocrats and bourgeois of 19th century France, and even a common visiting place for politicians or diplomats visiting the country. From the outside, no one would have suspected it was the International Temple of Vice. Its facade resembled that of an old building, similar to any petit hotel in central Paris, 7 stories tall and without balconies facing the street. However, once you crossed the threshold of Le Chabanais, you entered a bustling environment where pleasure, excess, and substances prevailed. Its main attraction was its themed rooms, furnished with peculiar armchairs designed to facilitate different types of sexual acts or practices. There were also more perverse spaces where those who enjoyed fetishism could indulge in all their depravity. What happened in the brothel stayed in the brothel. Le Chabanais became a luxury exclusively dedicated to the predators at the top of the Nazi food chain, and the aspiration of many officers during the occupation was to be promoted to access this legendary palace of pleasure. Within its walls, the most beautiful young French women unabashedly surrendered to the captains, satisfying all their needs and fulfilling their darkest desires. Meanwhile, the madams collected the loot, which was more substantial than what any Frenchman of the time could offer. In addition to cash, it was quite normal for Germans to arrive with gifts for the prostitutes, whether jewelry, clothing, or food, impossible to obtain in Parisian shops. This also had a negative aspect, as French citizens, especially fervent opponents of the German occupation, began to develop great resentment towards the sex workers. Dubbed horizontal collaborators by the resistance in a clear pejorative gesture towards their occupation, the prostitutes slowly became enemies of their compatriots, who were poisoned by humiliation and resentment. By the end of the war, after France was liberated, the people were relentless and brutal towards the prostitutes and the girls of the brothels. The Nazi invasion shattered French society in many ways, and what we will see next was one of the most unjust outcomes for women.
El gentío pedía cuentas a quienes se habían acostado con los alemanes. Su delito, colaboración horizontal. Todo un ritual acompañaba a estas decapitaciones dulces, orquestadas por resistentes de la 11ª hora. Raparon la cabeza a más de 20.000 mujeres.
A través de una especie de catarsis, hicieron recaer sobre las mujeres todos los malos comportamientos de ese periodo en un intento de liberarse ellos mismos de sus faltas, de sus cobardías, de su pasividad, haciéndole pagar por ello a quien al acostarse con el enemigo había elegido el lado malo de la historia.
The occupation model, in which Nazi officers fed their soldiers' morale with local prostitutes, was replicated throughout the countries invaded by the Reich. But in Poland, the situation was not as simple as in France. While Parisian women often opted for sex work, either because it was the only way to earn money or to survive the war, Polish women were forced into prostitution. The need to keep soldiers busy with banal pleasures, to prevent them from being aware of the acts they were carrying out, prompted the Wehrmacht to run its own brothels throughout the conquered territory. Polish society, which suffered firsthand from the brutality of the Nazis, even more than any other occupied nation, was not prepared to offer the vastness of vices that Hitler's soldiers demanded. At first, the Germans staged many street harassment scenarios against the women of the civilian population. They approached them, touched them without their permission, searched and groped them under any excuse, and threatened to do even worse things to them. And in fact, the situation worsened on its own. Although the officers did not support the soldiers' conduct, they turned a deaf ear to the complaints of people who denounced this type of act. Abuse became a custom among German soldiers stationed in Poland, and far from ending the problem, the Nazi leaders decided to make this type of conduct official. By the beginning of 1941, German commanders allowed sexual exploitation in the territories of Poland and the Soviet Union. But, unlike in France, in this case it would be carried out through the capture of young women between 15 and 25 years old, who were smuggled to brothels requisitioned or directly set up by the Wehrmacht. This sinister practice of human trafficking came to have its own name: the Rifle. These were raids carried out by police or military officers, in which they arrested local girls and loaded them onto trucks to take them to brothels or barracks, where they were brutally raped. At the end of the war, the atrocities carried out in these places would become known. Some women and girls who managed to escape declared that they were forced to serve an average of 32 men a day. But this service set up by the army itself was not free. Nazi officials charged their own soldiers. Those who visited the brothels of horror were allocated 15 minutes at a nominal cost of 3 Reichsmarks, the current German currency of the time. Girls who did not die during work and became pregnant or unable to work could be released. Such is the case of a terrible event that occurred in Krakow when 2 15-year-old girls returned home very pregnant after being missing for a long time. According to the young women's accounts, they had been sexually exploited until the Nazis deemed them no longer fit for work. But these brutal activities went beyond Poland's borders. In the Soviet Union, because of the Germans' hatred of Slavs, even the circumstances of the women's capture were extremely violent. A post-war report by the International Military Tribunal describes, in the city of Smolensk, the German command opened a brothel for agents in one of the hotels to which hundreds of women and girls were taken. They were dragged through the street by their arms and hair. During the occupations, the Wehrmacht managed to establish an exhaustively bureaucratic system for the management of its sexual exploitation brothels. This originated in France, but spread to other countries, despite the brutal operational differences already mentioned. During the Nuremberg trials, several accusations were brought against high-ranking Nazi officials, as there were documents showing that sex workers, both voluntary and enslaved, were subjected to medical examinations to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. Some allegations indicated that these practices were carried out to prevent soldiers from taking out their libido on civilian women, but because cases of kidnapping and human trafficking were recorded in the Soviet Union and Poland, many Germans were convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. But as if all this were not enough, we still have to talk about the most brutal brothels created by the Nazis. If the history of prostitution in the civil societies of European countries was already quite gruesome, you can't imagine what happened inside the concentration camps established by the Third Reich. That's right. The large prisons and extermination centers with which Hitler articulated the Holocaust were not only bastions of slavery, forced labor, induced starvation, and mass murder. They also created brothels of horror, spaces inhabited by sexual exploitation, abuse, and inhumanity. If outside the walls the situation was bad, inside it was even worse. The first brothel was created in the Mauthausen-Gusen camp in 1942, and was followed by those of Auschwitz and Buchenwald in 1943, and a year later, Neuengamme, Dachau, Dora Mittelbau, Sachsenhausen, and Flossenburg were added. The practices within these barracks had similarities with those of ordinary brothels, but also great differences. The forced brothel at Mauthausen was born as a kind of experiment to try to motivate the Jewish population that worked during their imprisonment. The idea of exploiting women so that the other prisoners would increase their productivity seemed logical, but this never happened. The truth is that most of the prisoners were completely physically exhausted to carry out the sexual act. In a matter of weeks, the barracks of perversion became a place of entertainment for the German criminals, the kapos, and the guards themselves. In fact, its official name was established, Lagerbordell, which simply meant brothel of the camps. But among the Nazis it was called Freudenabteilungen, which meant the division of joy, alluding to how much they enjoyed visiting those corners of the enormous prison. These places were usually located in barracks a little away from the central areas and had their own perimeter walls with barbed wire. In the smallest camps, they could house 20 private rooms for prisoners who were forced to sexually service visitors. In larger facilities, these numbers grew exponentially. The exploited Jews had to be replaced continuously, as they arrived at the brothels in a deplorable state of health, and were usually taken away in even worse conditions, sick and on the verge of death from exhaustion. These sinister buildings were guarded by female guards, who sometimes ran them or served the officers who took the profits. Some Nazis took advantage of these places of horror to carry out their own experiments, as was Heinrich Himmler himself, who decided to carry out corrective rapes in Auschwitz. During the Holocaust, Jews identified as homosexual, transgender, or any other identity were marked with a pink triangle on their sleeves. The head of the SS ordered lesbians and homosexuals to be systematically raped by members of the opposite sex, attempting to correct what he considered a deviation from human nature. In Himmler's own words, he only wanted to cure homosexuality through the therapy of knowing the joy of the opposite sex. Of course, this was just another act of cruelty based on the profound ignorance and recalcitrant hatred that the Nazis held against anyone who was different from them. For that matter, the women had been raped only for pleasure, without any kind of experimentation involved, and most of the inmates used for this purpose died in the brothels before their fellow inmates were taken to the gas chambers. In total, it is estimated that some 32,000 women were forced into sexual work for Hitler's forces, and that the Führer himself accepted and encouraged these practices. Among all the horrors of war, there are some that are preferred not to be told, but we must remember them so as not to repeat them again. Thank you very much for following us to the end. If you liked our content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. See you next time.